This is the third in a series, the third and the last in a series that I called, I think it was something like Meeting Our Interdependence with Compassion. And the topic is the three marks of existence. And when I first thought of doing this, a lot of times, I don't know if all teachers do this, but I tend to find my blind spots and then go, I better teach that so I can have the opportunity to research it and dig into it. And so I've had a lot of time to do that over the last 3 months. And when I first thought of it, I kind of just thought there are impermanence and suffering and no self. And before I even really looked into it, I was like, I'm putting no self last because that's going to be hard. And so I thought like I'll have more time to research it, but I really kind of just meant I'll procrastinate a little bit on it. And here we are. So what I ended up doing with this one is I'm going to rely heavily on a teaching by Ponlop Rinpoche. There is a teaching by Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche that's available at Namse Bangso called Interdependence and Emptiness. That I highly recommend. It's a short spiral-bound commentary. And that one is fantastic teaching. But the approach that Ponlop Rinpoche took, I thought, accorded more with what I'd done in the other two talks. So I guess let's start with the refuge prayer, and then we'll dive in. So let's do once in English, once in Tibetan, and once in English. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing the six perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Sangye chidang sukhi chodnam la chanchu padu dakni kyapsuchi daki jinso ki pe sunam ki rola penchi sangye drupasho. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By accomplishing the six perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. Bauden sawe lama rinpoche dagi jiwa pediten jula padun champo go neje sunte usun tuking drup sa du so. I just had a fun memory. The last time I saw Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, he was in the men's retreat house. This must have been like June of 2019. And we didn't normally do this, but I just thought of asking if we could all receive a blessing, individually. Go up and receive a blessing, those great head bumps that Rinpoche would give. And so we did. And I remember when I went up for my head bump, I was not cutting my hair for the whole retreat. So I had a big long beard and I kind of leaned in for my head bump and I didn't feel anything. And then I felt like this pressure on my chin and I opened my eyes and he was like pulling on my beard and he took his other hand and was like, and then he gave me the good head bump. But not apropos of anything, but I thought I would share. So, I've said probably many times that brevity is not my strong suit, and so there's always things I end up having to cut from these kind of talks. And so I gave this one a dry run earlier this week, and I realized I was going to have to take out a piece that I really wanted to include, which was about the 3 stages of practice. And I think it's good to at least mention it in the beginning of talks, so we have a kind of a template of how to best process this kind of information. So the idea is that the stages are listening, contemplation, and meditation. And in the listening stage, we're basically just open to new information, taking it in. And then the contemplation stage, ideally, will take place afterwards, and as you move through life, just taking the information and kind of plugging it into your own experience, really kind of examining it, turning it over. This is like when the Buddha said, examine my teachings like they were gold. Don't just believe them because I say it. So that contemplation step is really important. And then through that contemplation, when we reach some kind of certainty, we then meditate. And people often ask, how do you meditate on what you just contemplated? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, in particularly related to this no self idea. But really, the idea is that you dig into the conceptuality on the contemplation, and then you just let it recede into like ultimate truth. Let it just recede into the ocean of wisdom mind. So there really isn't anything to meditate on. You just meditate. Just rest the mind, and that's the third stage. So this will be primarily listening, and I wanted to do a thing where I contemplated each of the 3 marks and stuff like that, but it was too ambitious. So, but I still recommend you give it a shot on your own, and do that template with kind of everything that you learn. So before we actually dive in, let's take just a short couple minutes and place our attention on the breath, do a little bit of calm abiding meditation, and then we'll jump into no self. So, like I said, this is a kind of a complex topic, and I think it's good to remember that it's helpful sometimes with Dharma teachings to kind of just be like the ground to the rain, and just sort of let the rain fall, and it'll sink in there. And when we need certain bits, it may pop up, and surprise us. So it is likely the case that this will be a lot of information. So my best advice is to just be open and let the information come in. Hopefully I'll do a halfway decent job of presenting it. But my other little bit of advice here would be, with a mind towards later contemplation, it might be a good idea to have a pen and paper ready, because there's a lot we're going to talk about today that is information, but really should be a contemplation later. So there'll be a lot of things we talk about today that if you, when you hear something that would be good food for contemplation, write that down. And then later on, you can actually take the time to do that as part of your practice. And no self, especially this concept of no self, this idea especially requires contemplation, because it's our most fundamental of all of our misconceptions. It's the most basic of our wrong views. And most of our fixation on the self and phenomena is habitual and instinctive and even unconscious. But contemplation helps to bring that fixation to light, gives us certainty that comes with a clear view of what's really happening or not happening. And again, belief is in the self is the most firmly entrenched of our convictions. And whether we want to believe it or not, our belief in the teachings of the Buddha are actually quite new, and it's kind of quite weak in comparison to how firmly entrenched this belief in a self is. So the only real way to counter our strong habitual notions of a self is to gradually deconstruct it over and over and over again until we have a personal lived experience of the lack of self. But the idea of no self is not necessarily like an attractive thing to us. We know what it feels like to have a self, and we may not want to even find out what it feels like not to. But there's really no need to fear. Like, losing ego doesn't mean we become stupid or incapable. It means that we actually have a much more clear and precise understanding of our world, and in particular, the effects of our actions within it. So we actually become more skillful when we recognize no self. And furthermore, there's not even a me really to lose. Even beginning to discover that is liberating, and it makes us feel less encumbered. We spend so much of our time trying to protect me, and similarly trying not to lose what me has. And all that takes just an awful lot of work. So things get much easier as we begin to familiarize ourselves with no self. Also, as we relinquish clinging to the illusion of a self, it allows our innate positive qualities to shine forth more naturally and brilliantly. And there's actually examples in regular life that can give us clues of how no self can work in positive ways. The example Ponlop Rinpoche provides is like with a musician. You know, when you start learning an instrument, you're kind of trying to just figure out how to make a good sound. You know, there's trying to figure out where to put your fingers. If it's a guitar, if it's like a double reed, then you're spending a lot of time just trying to figure out how to not sound awful with one note. So like in the beginning, there's a lot of learning and a lot of thinking to be done, and a really clear sense that there's a separateness between you and the instrument and the music. But the more you progress, the more you find yourself in these situations where you just kind of lose yourself in the music, and there is no separation between you and the instrument or the music. And that's a wonderful feeling, you know. There's probably similar things for visual artists, I would imagine, things like that, maybe even dancing, you know, for any of us. So we have some idea of what the goodness of not clinging to this idea of a self is like. One of the first steps towards that lived experience of enlightened mind is just to be present with our emotions. I think we talked in one of the previous two talks about emotion being like a basic energy that just kind of wells up. But instead of being with that energy, we tend to divert into a story or into a narrative or into blame, you know. But we could just be with the energy of that emotion. And in that moment, in those moments of those upwellings of energy, that's who we are. You know, that's really who we are. We're not the story. Ponlop Rinpoche uses an example of monkey mind, but I've never heard it described this way. He talks about, a lot of times we talk about monkey mind as being, at least in the sense of jumping from one thought to another, like a monkey jumps from one branch to another. But Ponlop Rinpoche mentioned how some monkeys do not let go of a branch until they're sure they have a good grip on whatever branch they're jumping to. And other monkeys let go before they know where they're swinging. And you can guess what happens. They fall. And if similarly, like if we let go of our emotions and the present moment too quickly, before we experience our awakened nature in that moment, which we can, that's how we fall, you know. So these opportunities of just being present with that energy without diverting into a story and what's really just distraction. It's really important to try to be with those moments because our emotions and that experience of the present moment is potent. And it's an experience of pure energy, rising and falling in various ways. And it's ideal for us to familiarize ourselves with our mind. And ultimately, that's how we see our Buddha nature. But we keep wanting to swing right on to the next thing. And side note, we do this with our Buddhist practices too. maybe not all of us, but I can tell you that there was a constant advice in 3-year retreat from Rinpoche to just be in the practice we're doing now. Like you're really lucky to be in the Guru Yoga of Gampopa. You're really lucky to be here in the inner practice of Vajrayogini. And there we were, very lucky and thinking, ooh, 1 month until secret practice, Chakrasambhara's coming up, 4 months, So we're always kind of wanting to look for that next thing, right? So just being where we are is a really easy method of starting to be able to plug in, or to be really more appropriately see and get to know our Buddha nature. And similarly, if we're having a good experience or a positive experience, there's nowhere to go. Like we don't have to leave, but we also need to stay present. And that means not diverting into narratives or stories or conceptualizations with a positive experience as well. Just being present with the experience. And this reminded me, I feel like it's not too different than in shamatha, when we actually have those moments where we are resting stably with our attention on the breath or whatever the support for our meditation is. And we have that moment where we're doing it, and then we start thinking about it. Like, I got this. I'm meditating. This is awesome, And there's the story, right? So similarly, like, good situations, bad situations, in either case, we could also just be present, and that's the ideal thing to do. So what is wrong? What's actually wrong with the ego clinging? Clinging to the self. The problem is it's what creates our experience of conditioned existence. So because we have an idea of self, we also co-emergently get this idea of other. They come together. And so there's a duality then. And because of the duality, we cling to the self. That's the self-cherishing. And the self-cherishing leads to our afflictions, our negative emotions, anger and desire and jealousy and pride and ignorance. And those afflictions lead to actions, karma. And karma, acting, creates propensities, tendencies. Propensity is like a go-to reaction to a situation, like just the reaction that we don't really think too much about, but we feel like we've got some familiarity with the situation or the circumstances, so we just pull out our go-to reaction. That's what we do here. More often than not, those reactions will be negative, meaning based on self-cherishing. And the reason that's bad is because that reinforces our illusion of a self. And it convinces us further that our illusion is real when it's not. So not only is our self-concept an illusion, but we forget that we created the illusion in the first place, and are further creating and reinforcing it with each action that we do that's based in self-clinging. So think about anger, for instance. How often have you been repeatedly in a situation that causes you anger? And because you feel like you've been there before, like i.e. like this idea of like it just keeps happening, you get angrier and angrier each time. We justify the intensity of our anger oftentimes based on how often something has happened to us or how recently it's happened and how angry it's made us previously. We have to kind of top it a little bit. So we actually, on some level, think we need to escalate each time we meet with a situation that has previously caused us a negative emotion, like anger. So we're habituating and training ourselves for this. And we're creating this idea of an angry self whenever that self encounters situation X. So situation X plus our self-concept equals anger. And this is an equation that we made up, and it is our conditioned existence. It's this habit of doing that's really the problem. It's not so much the feelings of good or bad or attachment or aversion or neutral. It's the habits of self-clinging that we react with. So getting to know the true state of our experience, our true identity, means becoming familiar with our sense of me and mine. And this is actually the same sense that determines other things and other people to be real as well. So ordinary sense of I or self is our fundamental reference point. It's the center of our mandala. We think we're in the middle and everything else revolves around us. And as the center, everything and everyone else should be using us as their reference point. And there's lots of versions of this, including our names and our locations. You know, I think because I call myself Adam, and most everyone else does too, that there must really be an Adam. And similarly, because you all appear to be in California and I seem to be here in Ohio, then there must be a there and a here. So Polnap Rinpoche says that this first innate layer of dealing with the self and other phenomena is actually somewhat neutral. But the problem is that we don't stop there. We move on to a secondary level. And based on our perceptions, we consider reference points and observations to be valid. And this is how we land at things like good and bad and appropriate and inappropriate. And we buttress those views with things like religion and philosophy and science. And these give our imputed reference points a seeming context. Like the idea of other being a proof for self. Many times we use our belief systems and our religions and our worldviews, these large, like standardized collections of relative viewpoints. We use those as a proof for our own imputed viewpoints. So these are the two fundamental fixations. There's an innate self-clinging and then this imputed self-clinging. And with the innate clinging to what seems to be me, there are three primary wrong ideas. And these are the incorrect assumptions that the self is permanent, singular, and independent. Clinging to the self as permanent arises due to ignorance about time. Clinging to the self as singular arises from ignorance about the collection of objects that are mistakenly regarded as a self. And clinging to the self as independent arises from ignorance about causes and conditions. So there are three primary kinds of ignorance behind our innate clinging to the self. And ignorance is cleared away naturally by awareness. It's like a light bulb illuminating a dark room. So rather than attempting to chase away our ignorance, we should really be trying to cultivate awareness of the truth of the situation. And the clearer we can become about how things really are, the less chance of our ignorance stands. Everything will be brought into the light. So we think we know on a surface level that we're impermanent and that we are not independent. But when we meet with signs of impermanence, we tend to react with surprise and even disgust. Think about noticing the signs of aging, right? We're resistant to what we think we know is true. And this is a sign that we don't really know these things. We require a great deal more familiarity to grasp them. So for instance, one contemplation that Polnap Rinpoche suggests is to consider how it affects our sense of identity to imagine losing, one by one, all of our body parts. At what point in that process of losing our limbs do we still feel like the same person whom we believe we are now? When we're in full possession of them, are we still us after losing a finger, a hand, both arms? What if we're just a torso and a head? When do we cease to exist as a person altogether? These are some of those examples of things that would be good to contemplate. And we can apply the same contemplation to losing our external reference points as well. So like losing relatives, friends, possessions. Or what about certain mental capabilities? What about cognitive decline that so often accompanies aging? Are we still us after we've lost all that? These contemplations may seem a little strange, but they can help us learn something personal and something deeply intimate about ourselves and our own styles of attachment. And this is very different and much more impactful than some impersonal theoretical understanding. This also gets at our perception of the body as a singular thing rather than as a collection. So taking the variety of momentary perceptions, emotions, and thoughts to be a monolithic mind, and thinking of external things as unitary, as in the classic example of like wheels, axis, and a carriage arranged just so, being a chariot. So regarding permanence or illusions of permanence, and ignorance of the way time seems to work, we take past, present, and future and roll them all together and say, that's me. I'm who I have been, who I always have been, and will be into the unknown, uncertain future as well. We forget that each moment is unique and full of possibility. We forget that we're quite literally reborn into every moment, propelled by our past, but with this vast, untapped capabilities to renew, reorganize, and change. We forget that our experience is a collection of unique moments, and we do not need to carry the past along with us into the future. We can do something completely new in every moment, something completely fresh. Like perhaps just interact with where we are right now, rather than covering over our present experience with a tarp of past neuroses, hiding the moment in projections to the point where we can barely make out the outline of the present moment under the weighted blanket of our self-clinging. We refer to the self as a singularity, but even with the most basic of examinations, we see that it's composed of at least a body and a mind. There are at least two distinct elements, and each of them change on their own, but also in dependence on each other. Our body shows the signs of aging, but our mind resists because it still feels like a 20-year-old. Our seemingly 20-year-old mind wants to stay up late to watch that movie with our significant other, but our 60-year-old body tells us we don't like staying up past 10 p.m. So even these two constituent parts of the self, or the seeming sense of self, are clearly separate, and each of them are made up of their own component parts. The body has its limbs, its organs, its skin, all of which can be damaged, lost, etc. And the mind is actually a vast collection of memories, capabilities, propensities, preferences. There are parts of our mind, of what our mind is now, that were not there at the beginning of this talk. Whole new pieces of the collection have been added in the last 30 minutes, or less. Like dominoes, but better, or worse, depending on how you look at it. We believe our self is an independent thing, and we're in control. We believe the self exists on its own and is not dependent on anything. But the very idea of a self is based on causes and conditions, built on causes and conditions. Without the coming together of all these various causes and conditions, there would be no self. So with analysis, we see that the ideas we have about the self are incorrect. We think that it's permanent, but examination reveals it's clearly impermanent. We think the self is a singular thing, but analysis reveals it's made up of many constituent parts. And we think it's independent, but we don't have to look very hard to see how many causes and conditions affect us and have to come together for our experience to appear. So our assumptions, our regular ideas, do not accord with the true nature of things. Furthermore, when we examine this self, we find two aspects. The collection of objects we misconceive as our self, and the mind that fixates on them as a self. So I want to read right from this Paul Rinpoche teaching, because this part's kind of the hardest to do off the top of one's head. He's got a really good thing. So we'll treat this kind of like a guided contemplation. So really try as we go through this to ask yourself these questions. So he says, what is it that we cling to as ourself, as me? If we think that the self is in the body, for example, then we would ask, is the self the whole body or one of its parts? Is it the brain? Is it the heart? If we've gone through all body parts and conclude that none of them is the self, then there is not a self within any of them. then we apply the same line of investigation to the mind. If we think that the self is most likely to be located within our feelings, we would ask, is the self the totality of feelings, or is it just one particular feeling? If it is one feeling, which one is it? Then we continue in the same way with our perceptions, thoughts, and other mental events. If we say that the self is our body, then it would follow that our body is permanent, singular, and independent of other causes and conditions, because this is how we perceive ourself. But in that case, it would follow that the self, which is singular and is the body, could not include any of the aspects of the mind. Therefore, our self would exist as the body alone and lack any attributes of the mind. The reverse applies if we think of ourself as being just our mind. If we think that the body and mind together are the self, we would have at least two separate selves, or many more, if we consider all the different parts of body and mind. However, this clearly contradicts our experience and shows that the self is neither singular nor permanent, because when we think of the self, we think not only of our body, but also of all the many things that that are going on in our mind. When we examine in this way, the question is, where can we find ourself and the clinging to it? Sometimes we perceive the sense of I or me as being our body. For example, when we have a headache, we say, I have a headache. We don't say the body has a headache. In this situation, we perceive our body or our head as the self. Similarly, when we cut ourselves in the kitchen, we say, I cut myself. Again, we see ourselves as our body. There are many more examples that show us how we often perceive the body as the self. However, when we experience mental suffering, we say, I'm unhappy, I'm depressed. In this case, we're regarding our mind as the self. Our fixation is switched over to a different object. In everyday life, we constantly alternate between fixating on ourself as being either the body as a whole, certain parts of it, the mind as a whole, or certain aspects of the mind. Much of our confusion and suffering comes from not seeing this clearly, which is why we don't really know who we are. When we look at the self of a person, we find two elements, the object of self-clinging and the subjective mind that clings in this way. These two, object and subject, exist only by way of their interdependent relationship. If we have thoroughly analyzed and found no self in any or all the parts of our body and mind, then it naturally follows that the mind that fixates on that non-existent self must actually also be non-existent. In other words, the mind of fixation, the subject that seems to observe and cling to a non-existent object, cannot exist really either. It is just a fixed idea holding on to a phantom. Once we have determined that there is no self anywhere in all these objects that could be its possible location, we can be certain that the self simply does not exist. As a consequence, we can also be certain that the mind that clings to that notion has no independent reality either. Therefore, there is absolutely no existence of both a self or the clinging to it. From the Buddhist point of view, the self exists only on the level of relative reality, and only as a conventional imputation on the basis of our body and mind. That's why it's called interdependent. Our self is only experienced based on the coming together of all our particular elements of body and mind. Whatever arises based on causes and conditions has no true existence of its own. In other words, anything that is actually a collection has no true existence of its own. And that's why we have that traditional analogy of the chariot, or updated like the car. So a car is made up of all kinds of parts, wheels, body, seat, engine. But each of these parts alone are not a car. There is no car or carness in the car seat. and there's no car in the engine or any of the parts except for the carburetor, because there's a car in there. Just kidding, of course. A carburetor is not a car. And the car is only a label for a collection. It's our name for that group of stuff that comes together. And our self is no different in that regard. It appears to arise based on the coming together of a collection of parts, a collection of causes and conditions, each arising in dependence upon a whole other set of interdependent causes and conditions. And this is interdependence. Any imputed thing, whether it's a car or a self, is empty of anything permanent, singular or independent. Meaning not only is the car and the self not truly existent, it doesn't even contain anything that's truly existent. There is no truly existent car, and there's no truly existent self. So how does it exist? Thinking in terms of the body, we know it appears to be physical matter. And we think of that as solid, even though we know that even the tiny little particles that make up our body, atoms, are mostly open space. There's this nucleus, and then there's stuff orbiting around it. And have you ever heard like how far apart those orbiting particles are? If the nucleus of a hydrogen atom were the size of a basketball, then its orbiting electron would be found about 2 miles away. All the space in between the electron and the nucleus is empty. So if you imagine standing on like a completely level surface, like a humongous dry lake bed, and attaching a 2-mile long string to a basketball affixed to the ground, then walking 2 miles out until that string is tight, and then walking the radius around the basketball, that's, relatively speaking, how much empty space is in a single particle. And the electron, you in this case, since you're the one doing the orbit, is actually smaller than the nucleus. So all the solidity in that 4-mile diameter circle is like a basketball and a baseball. And it's actually really 3D, more like an orb, right? And that's what makes up our body and everything. Everything we think is solid, physical matter, is by far empty, literally. Not just in Buddhist view and concepts, like science is finding this. And there's also parts to the atom, right? So there's the nucleus, the proton, the electrons, and what are they made up of? So like the question has been like, is there a smallest building block? The Buddhist question was many times like, is there a partless particle? Can we break something down to the point where it has no parts? And remember, this doesn't mean like one, let's say like solid infinitesimal cube or orb or shape of any kind, because shapes have sides and shapes have parts. If something has a left and a right or a top and a bottom, those are parts. They exist independence on each other. They're interdependent and therefore empty of any true existence. And I think this is why quantum physics has led us to results like what some of us may have seen in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? From like 20 years ago, great movie. These findings can kind of baffle the mind. Ideas that like at the smallest level that we're able to detect, the building blocks seem to be more like possibilities and tendencies impacted by the observer than any kind of permanent, singular, or independent fundamental particle. At the most basic level, according to modern physics, it appears that our physical world is impacted by the mental activity of the observer. And this is probably getting too far down a science rabbit hole and way out of my league, but it's worth thinking about. So let's look at the mind, though. In what way does it exist? For us, the idea of a thought or a feeling is the most prominent example of what makes up the mind. So we can look at like a single thought. And what we may find is that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But we tend to notice the middle part, where we might call that like the abiding part. And it has to have a beginning and an end, or else it would always be there, right? So that part that we do notice most often, the abiding, there's also a beginning and an end to that, to the abiding itself. So in other words, even what seems to be a single thought is itself interdependent. With examination, we cannot locate a permanent, singular, independent existence, even in the mind. When we don't look very closely, our body and mind and the self imputed upon them seem to be quite real and solid. It's why the analogy of a mirage is common here. We really see the water on the hot road ahead of us. No one can deny that we see it. But it's not really there at all. It was always just a convergence of certain set of causes and conditions that made it appear from our relative viewpoint that there was something there. There's a hot road, the certain angle we're at to see it, the sun, the temperature, the wind. I mean, all these things come together to create that experience that we have, the appearance that we have. There's no existence of its own there, completely interdependent. Ponlop Rinpoche says, when we look closely at our experiences, we find only the arising, abiding, and ceasing of selfless, ungraspable, and transitory states. And this is true of everything. The body, the mind, the house, the car, the friends, the earth, the money, the sickness, the victory, and the end. Recognizing that, we develop unshakable certainty that all phenomena are unfindable and lack any inherent existence or nature of their own. That's when our analysis has reached its goal. So then what is reality? Ponlop Rinpoche says it's consensus. It's consensus among our friends and family, because if we all experience a table in the dining room, we assume it must be there. Other people see it too. Our view of the reality of the table arises in dependence on the similar view of others who are also not analyzing the situation very deeply. If one person sees a pink elephant in the dining room, though, we think they must be crazy. But if we all see it, it's got to be real, right? But we also do this with our faculties, our own faculties. If we hear a cat, but we don't see one or feel one, we're pretty sure it's just a door squeaking or our imagination or the wind. But if we hear a cat and we see it and we walk over and give it a good snuggle, like there's apparent consensus there. So we think it must be real because there's consensus. Ponlop Rinpoche calls this majority confusion. Because as he says, from the point of view of someone who sees things as they actually are, no matter how many ordinary beings mistakenly agree about the nature of existence and what is real, that does not change what is truly the case. We have so much habitual momentum built up in seeing things as real and truly existent. That's our strong habitual tendency. And we bring that into everything we experience. When we train in this kind of analysis, though, Buddhist analysis, we're trying to reverse that trend by learning to see phenomena as they actually are. Empty. Empty of any real existence, empty of any self-concept at all. Not just us and the self, but everything. Nothing is what we call it in its true essence. And we need to train over and over and over in this in order to counteract our tendency for the opposite. I think in a previous talk I mentioned how the Tibetan word gom we frequently translate as to meditate, but Karl Brunholz has pointed out that it actually means, it actually doesn't have any connotation of anyone doing it. It's not like if you think of like run or running, I mean, that's not a great example, but if you think of a verb that implies a person doing it, meditate is not that. Meditation is like a thing that happens. So it's actually more like rain. You know, if you hear rain, you don't think someone is raining, you know. Meditation just happens, and then we let it happen. That's really what is meant. Like we translate as that to meditate, and you can see how many problems can arise from that, because then we think we have to do this thing. But that's not what it actually means. And I'd heard that before, but in this teaching, I was surprised I hadn't learned what the Sanskrit term for meditation, what that actually connotates. So Polnap Rinpoche said that the Sanskrit term literally means to perfume. Like perfume our mind with the insight into emptiness until the scent of this insight becomes inseparable from and a natural part of our mind's fabric. So we have to recognize that these analyses we discussed today are all from the point of view of ultimate reality, not our relative truth, not our consensus, conventional reality. From our relative point of view, no doubt, things appear to exist. But we need to understand that that existence is purely interdependent. Nothing in our relative reality is permanent, singular, or independent. But we have to acknowledge that without analysis, they appear that way. And our tendency is to assume that they are that way. We have to recognize that dynamic clearly as well. Because of this, the Buddha taught the foundational vehicle, the Hinayana, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. In that cycle of teachings, he talked about karma, causes and conditions, and how, using that, folks can transform the mental afflictions and achieve liberation from suffering. But that refers specifically to the appearance of a relative interdependent reality, one examined only at the surface level. And Polnap Rinpoche cautions us not to mix our realities. He tells a really interesting anecdote about somebody asking him, if everything is empty, isn't your chair empty too? To which he replied, yes, of course it's empty. And the student followed up, then how can you sit? Why don't you just fall on the floor if it's empty? And Polnap Rinpoche said, what this person was trying to do was to put a relative solid person on an absolute unreal and empty chair, thus mixing the two truths. So you must see that when the chair is empty, the person is empty too. So as we contemplate these kind of things, what may feel a little strange about this kind of analysis is that the certainty we're going to arrive at is the certainty of not finding. So that feels a little different than, for instance, when we look for our keys or the perfect spatula to flip my amazing Impossible Burger taquitos. And that's because we're looking for what was never actually there. And we've said we sure as heck think the self is really, truly existent. But it's not. And that's why it's so important to continually go looking for it and not finding it. We need to experience again and again not finding it. And our certainty here is an experience, not a concept. It's not a collection, and it's not a comparison. It's simply the experience of emptiness or limitlessness. And when we get there, we need to simply just rest in that experience without any concepts. We just relax and let go of all thoughts, including even the idea of an observer. Polnap Rinpoche says, this is the point when the observer and the observed merge. They come together and there's no more separation. It's like rubbing two sticks together to create a fire. The fire that's produced will burn both sticks, not just one. In the same way, when you realize selflessness, the fire of that wisdom will transcend both subject and object. Thus, we relax and rest freely. Then he says, and this is really important, whether we feel we have achieved a complete experience of selflessness or only a glimpse, it does not matter. We just rest in the nature of the groundlessness. I want to read another short segment from his teaching. This is the first stage of the meditation on emptiness, not finding the self and then resting in the certainty of its non-existence. We reach this point through analysis. Look at your body. Look at your mind. Where is the self? Then rest in the very moment of not finding the self. It is crucial not to miss that moment. Sometimes we may get lost in the analysis. We don't find anything and we think, oh, I'll just go back over it again and maybe find something. Instead, at the point when we don't find anything, we should rest as much as we can. At other times, when we have come to the point of resting, we find the experience so beautiful that we want to hold on to it. And then grasping arises, and the thought process resumes. At that point, we should return to our analysis. So I think the idea here is like we don't want our analysis to turn into a discursive fest, like I think he uses earlier in this teaching, he says like a discursive thinking safe zone, so we want our analysis we want to be resting our attention on that analysis. And if we notice we're just jumping one thought to another and we've gone into monkey mind, then it's probably a good idea to maybe just do a little sitting meditation for a while and then resume your analysis. Or you might be at the point in your practice where you're just beyond your capability and you need to take a break, and then come back. But we want to make sure that we're, doing an analysis and then resting, doing an analysis and resting, not zooming off into monkey mind. So to conclude, through repeated practice of meditation on no self or selflessness, we gain a genuine understanding of what's really meant by the middle way. The middle way meaning somewhere between existence and non-existence. If we cling too much to the idea of existence, the reality of our self and of the appearances this self perceives, we suffer because we're forgetting their ultimate nature is limitless, emptiness. We solidify what's not solid, and then metaphorically hit ourselves over the metaphorical head with it, causing unnecessary suffering based on reifying what's not real. Or perhaps we get so hung up on the idea of emptiness that we dismiss the interdependent existence of ourself and phenomena. Because it is not that nothing exists, it's that things only exist interdependently. They're not permanent, singular, or independent, as we usually believe. And that's what we need to correct, that misconception. So we can't dismiss relative truth either. And Ponlop Rinpoche says, no matter which extreme we fixate on, they are equal in their power to obscure the direct experience of utter mental openness, which is beyond all such conceptual fabrications. But he counsels we have to start our way to the middle by going to the extreme of non-existence, meaning we emphasize the empty or ultimate nature of mind and phenomena and de-emphasize the aspect of relative appearance. And this is because even if we do have a genuine experience of the limitless nature of everything, we're going to be pulled back by a sort of gravity towards the concept of existence. And he says that gravity is our habitual tendencies. It's our clinging to existence as solid and real. So with awareness, we can notice when we're swinging back in the direction of existence. And at that time, we give our mind a friendly shove back in the direction of non-existence. And we need to do this over and over and over again. But eventually, we find the middle way between the two views of existence and non-existence. And that's no self in a nutshell. Was it incredibly... I mean, like, when I share stuff like that, I feel like, is it interesting or is it like mind-boggling? I mean, it's kind of both for me.
Yeah. Well,
A lot to think about.
yeah.
Me too.
It's
Is
hard.
any-
I
Go
think
ahead.
you just start to grasp it, then a new idea hits, and then it brings you somewhere else, and then you're like, oh no, I can't do that because then I'm clinging to that, and I'm trying.
Oh, I think we muted her by
Sorry.
accident. That's all right.
Was I mute for that whole thing?
Sorry,
I
think
heard-
I did it. Sorry.
It's all right. I heard that like you oh yeah, say it again though. It's worthwhile for
Oh, I
sure.
don't know. It's almost like it's huge. So when I think, okay, I've got it, then I'm like, no, I can't because then I'm clinging to that. And then another idea comes, and then I'm trying to practice. It's just huge. It's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and there's I think it's Saraha quote where he said, it might be wrong about the source, but I know there's some quote about how like people who think things are solid are fools, but people who think things are empty are even more hopeless, because the idea being you can't cling on at either of these things, and it is really, particularly like working with like Lojong and stuff, like the ultimate bodhicitta, meditations, like just in the last 2 years of working with people on that, like that's such a tricky point because we all want to understand stuff. And like this is such a different thing where the idea is to rest in the not finding, or the not being able to conceptualize it. And that's so unfamiliar to us. Which is just another sign of everything we're talking about today. Like we want to have all the collections and all the comparisons and all that, all the concepts.
Actually, I wanted to ask something, Lama Adam. In terms of practice, usually the path we do of practice at the moment, I guess most of us do it, like we go through Nundro and then possibly have a Yidam practice later on, and specifically you having gone through the 3-year retreat. I'm just wondering, I personally don't do any contemplation meditation as such, like a direct contemplation on emptiness, because already I'm, not having much time. I'm already filled up with the practice itself I have. And I also have heard that in 3-year retreat, likewise, you have a lot of practices to do and a lot of, practices on your own, practices as a group, all the whatever things which come up on calendars and such. So is in our lineage, is that a point where you have the contemplation part of the practice, or where does it come in other words? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, one of the things that's so skillful about all our sadhana practices and yidam practices is they're a skillful approach at all of this. This is all kind of built into there. So, thinking in particular of like the dissolution phase, and also like the way we visualize deities as both vivid and insubstantial. There's that's the union of these ideas of existence and non-existence. So Tantra is just so, it's an amazing technology, really, that we're so lucky to be privy to. So in a way, you can, I think whatever practices your teacher gives you, I think will get you to these same ideas. But if this is a thing that you choose to add to your practice, there are traditions of all these kinds of commentaries and things like that. I think it's a really good question, and I'll do some more research on it and maybe bring you back more specific answer next time. But I never have thought about that question, and I can't say that anyone has told me specifically to do this as part of like my sitting practice. But in a way, Ponlop Rinpoche is saying that here. And then also there's things like if you've ever done Karma Pakshi practice, there's like the Kema section, where you're talking about things like this, and so there are a lot of things that are in the sadhanas that are basically statements of these things, and we chant them and we're chanting in rhythm and we just move right on. But we should really be thinking about all of those kinds of statements that blow past us in the sadhanas in another language. We should maybe take some time to actually read the English, and if we hit a part that makes a statement about the ultimate nature of things or about interdependence, really kind of take a minute to contemplate that. And contemplation can happen. The cool thing about it is you can do it kind of anywhere, anytime. You can do it in a waiting room or on the bus or at a red light or, when you need to break from your work. But it is also a nice thing to do on the cushion. And in a way, probably one of the most common contemplation practices is the 4 thoughts, the 4 thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma. And that's a really good one, like a basic contemplation to generate motivation for our practice. And similarly with that one, we're really reviewing an idea and then recognizing its truth. But then what we do with that contemplation in particular is then we generate the resolution to practice, like with the recognition of the truth of, for say, impermanence, which is one of the contemplations. When we really have some felt sense of its truth, we use that felt sense as the fuel for our practice, to make it easier to keep doing it. So that's a good example of something probably most of us have done, where we have probably some experience with contemplation being a big benefit, So, I think it's worthwhile to contemplate this stuff. And in the context of your daily practice is probably a good time to do it, because that's when your mind is a little more tranquil and you're a little bit more purposeful about the things you're doing. And I think there's always benefit, like Pulnap Rinpoche said here, like doing this again and again and again. So even if it's just one thing a day, like even if it's just like thinking about where's the self, is it in the body, and kind of reviewing till you don't find it, resting for a moment, and then moving on. There's benefit in that. We're building habit and familiarity with the truth of the situation that we've been missing for so long. So that's a good question, though. I feel like I kind of danced around it, but there's probably a real answer out there.
I mean, I understand, obviously. Sorry, I don't want to take up all the time.
No, that's fine.
But I understand,
I'm not in a hurry, too, by the way.
But I understand it's like the I guess the experiential part of the emptiness is built in any, almost all, well, every practice we do, I suppose. But this sort of, let's call it awareness, thinking of it. You know what I mean? Like that's what I was thinking.
Analytical
Analytical,
meditation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's not something which seems to be emphasized in the way the practices we get. So we don't sit down and go like, okay, let's really go step by step and do this thing like exactly like it's described, obviously. So it's interesting. Anyways, it occurred to me that I don't do it myself that much, because I more rely on the Southerners and the practices I have, and do it like this. But I don't really. And I'm wondering, do we have to also? We should put some work in to do that as well, to also, put the logical mind in the right direction. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
It's important for us to realize that these meditations on the traits form the basis of Vipassana meditation in the Hinayana path. So that when one calms the mind through shamatha and then turns towards meditation on the what they call the three characteristics of life: suffering, impermanence, and selflessness, those contemplations form what is Vipassana meditation. We always talk about Vipassana, which means tearing apart. So we're tearing apart reality and looking at it. I'm reminded of a quote from Buddhaghosa's Path of Purification that reads, he starts the book, suffering exists, but not the one who suffers. The path exists, but not the one who treads it. Enlightenment exists, but not the one who attains it.
That's awesome.
All these are meditations on selflessness.
Yeah, thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Yeah,
this has been a wonderful series. And we look forward to your joining us much more frequently, hopefully on a monthly basis. You can just get your classes ready. Yep.
I'll be back next month for sure. Yeah.
Good.
And just one more point on there too. I think, cause I don't do that regularly in my practice either, to be honest, but when I do it is kind of the whole rest of the day, if I'm on my game, so like, I think that's the kind of thing where if you're walking around and you could just be thinking about dinner or what that person said to you or whatever, you could also use that time to think about where yourself is, and then you could actually get something productive done,
It is actually fun to search for the self. And that's what I think Pulnap and you were talking about, to try to find it, because it's so elusive and it hops from topic to topic and depending on condition to condition. But this has been wonderful, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Anything else, or?
When Lama Adam, when you get off, I did have one thing that I wanted to mention to our group. You're welcome to stay on, but I don't want to also take up time for interactions with you.
Sure. If are there any other questions?
What's kind of like a quick thing to think about to take you, like before meditation, to take you to that thought process? Like, what's like a quick question Just like, where's the self? Is that like a,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the easiest one would be that idea of, is the self like if, for instance, I think what Charles was saying about how elusive it is. Like one thing I've often heard is like, is the self in your hand? And it's just by asking that question, all of a sudden it is,
Yeah.
or is it in my foot? Boom, there it is in your foot. So even those kind of very simple sort of examinations, I think, are helpful. But we are trying to arrive at that certainty of not finding it. So I think the key piece of the analytical aspect of this is recognizing that it can't be in multiple places and be one thing.
Yeah.
So that sort of view of recognizing that we can't find it, is actually, and that it is interdependent, is where we're trying to land.
Thank you.
Yeah, who's your kitty?
Yeah, Wally.
Hey, Wally. Zoom, the best part of Zoom has been meeting everybody's pets.
You can't see him because of my background filter, but
Oh, yeah.
it's being weird now. My hair is disappearing.
Well, if there's not everything else or anything else, I'll just say thank you guys very much. It's kind of a scary talk, so I confess any errors I may have made. They're completely my own. And I wish for the long life of all of our teachers and that they remain and continue to teach the Dharma. And let's dedicate the merit. By this merit, may we obtain the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemies' wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may we free all beings. Thank you.
Thank you.